I always thought I had the perfect family. At least, that's how it seemed to everyone else. My parents, successful, respected in our small town, had raised 2 children who fit neatly into the mold of what the world expected. We were the epitome of doing things right. Our house gleaming with accolades. Our smiles polished to perfection in family photos. My brother, Jason, had always been the one everyone praised. The golden boy. From the moment Jason was born, it was clear that he was special. He was the charming one, the athlete, the natural leader. He could do no wrong. I, on the other hand, was the quiet one, the dutiful child. The one who worked hard to keep up with the family's impossible standards. In a way, I was proud of the role I played. The steady, reliable one. But even as a child, I knew something wasn't quite right. I didn't feel like I fit in the way Jason did. There was always this distance between us, this invisible line that separated the two of us. He was the one people admired. I was the one they expected to follow in his footsteps. Growing up, I did everything I was supposed to. I made the grades. I attended every family function. I behaved with an almost obsessive desire to be everything my parents wanted me to be. And I was happy with it, or at least, I thought I was. I was the one they trusted with the important things. The one they relied on to keep everything together. It felt good, in a way, to be the dependable one. But, deep down, I also felt the weight of always having to measure up. I had learned to suppress my own desires, my own personality, because it seemed like that was the only way to truly belong. And then there was Jason, who had no real need to measure up. He was effortlessly perfect, the star athlete in school, the one with all the friends, the one who could charm anyone with a smile. My parents never saw him as anything less than the ideal. He didn't even have to try. It seemed, no one ever questioned his place in the family. In their eyes, he was everything a son should be. But there was a secret. I didn't know what it was, but I felt it in the air. Sometimes, when my parents thought I wasn't paying attention, I would catch glimpses of conversations between them, conversations that were always hushed. As if they were afraid someone would overhear. Whispers late at night, the way their voices would tremble when they spoke of Jason. I didn't think much of it at first. I just chalked it up to their stress, or maybe just the typical tension that every family had. I didn't question it. Why would I? Everything was perfect. Right, I did my part. They did theirs. And Jason was the golden child. We were a family, and that was all that mattered. At least, that's what I thought. I'll never forget the moment everything came crashing down. It wasn't one big, dramatic revelation, but a slow burn that built up over weeks. The truth seeped into my life, bit by bit, until I couldn't ignore it any longer. It started with an old box I found while cleaning the attic. It wasn't unusual to stumble upon forgotten items up there, but what caught my attention was the box marked "Important Papers." I wasn't looking for anything in particular, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside, there were old letters, photographs, and even some birth certificates. As I sifted through them, something strange caught my eye: Jason's birth certificate. The date was off. I knew the date of his birth by heart. But this was different. I pulled out another certificate, one I recognized as mine, and compared the two. The names on the certificate were the same, but there was something missing. There, beneath his name, was an unexpected detail. Father, Jonathan Richards. No surprise there. Jason had always been our father's son. But when I looked closer at the date, I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't the same. Jason's birth had been recorded months after mine. Months. Suddenly, all the whispered conversations, the looks between my parents, the strange tension I had sensed for years, it all came rushing at me. My mind raced. I wasn't stupid. The implications were obvious, even if I didn't want to believe them. I spent the next few hours poring through the rest of the papers. And there it was, an old letter, signed by a woman I didn't recognize. My heart skipped a beat. The letter was dated 2 years before Jason was born. It was addressed to my father. I didn't have to read far before I understood the nature of the message. It was about an affair. A surge of anger and disbelief swept over me. Jason wasn't my brother, not in the way I had always believed. He wasn't the golden child. He was the product of a secret, a lie, an affair my father had never admitted to. I wasn't the legitimate child, the one who belonged. I was the child who had been forced into a mold, who had been raised to believe that I was the perfect one because I had to be. But Jason, he was the one who had been chosen, who had been adored, despite not even being part of the original plan. How could my parents have lied to me like that? For years, I had lived in the shadow of a man who wasn't even mine. And yet, they treated him like royalty. They had pretended for my entire life that I was the other one. The one who had to prove my worth. While Jason could do no wrong, I was the child they never really wanted. Jason was the child they couldn't let go of, even if he wasn't truly theirs. And then I realized, my whole life had been a lie. That night, I barely slept. The discovery gnawed at me, eating away at every bit of the fragile reality I had built for myself. I tossed and turned, thoughts spiraling. I couldn't get the image of Jason out of my mind. My brother, my golden boy, wasn't even my brother. He wasn't the child my parents had raised me to believe he was. And the most gut-wrenching part, he didn't even know. He wasn't to blame for this. The blame rested solely on my parents. I spent the next few days in a daze, walking around as though I wasn't even present. My parents, as usual, were busy with their perfect lives. My father was still working long hours at his office, while my mother busied herself with social events and volunteer work. Jason, oblivious to everything, continued his life as the family's shining star. I couldn't look at them without feeling like the world had shifted beneath me. Every conversation, every look, felt like a lie. I tried to push the anger down, to keep it buried where no one could see. But it boiled in me, threatening to explode. The anger wasn't just for the betrayal. It was for the years I had wasted trying to be what they wanted me to be, while all along they were pushing their perfect image of a family onto me, ignoring the one thing that really mattered, the truth. I needed to confront them. I couldn't live like this anymore. But how? How could I even begin to ask the questions that burned in my throat? What would I say? Would they admit it? Or would they lie again? I decided to wait. I needed to be sure. I needed to be prepared. A week passed before I finally worked up the courage to confront my parents. I had spent that time replaying the moments in my mind, strategizing how the conversation would go. I thought I knew what they would say, how they would try to explain themselves. But deep down, I knew there was no explanation that would make it okay. I waited until we were all sitting together, the three of us around the dinner table as usual. Jason was at college, so it was just me and my parents, just the three of us. Like it had always been. The tension in the room felt suffocating. I stared at the family dinner plate, the polished silverware, the empty glasses. I almost couldn't breathe. I had always been the quiet one, the one who went along with whatever was expected. But not anymore. The truth had come crashing down, and I could no longer keep pretending. I looked at my parents. They looked back at me, waiting, smiling that familiar, strained smile, the kind that said everything was fine. Everything was under control. The lie they had told us all these years was still hanging in the air like a cloud. And they were waiting for me to play my part. But I couldn't. I cleared my throat. My voice was shaky, but I pressed on. I know. The words were simple, but they were a thunderclap. My mother froze, and my father's smile faltered. They both knew exactly what I was talking about. The air around us thickened, like the calm before a storm. I couldn't stop now. I had to say it. I know about Jason, I said, my voice rising. I know the truth. Their faces drained of color. My mother's hand shook as she put down her glass of water. My father's jaw clenched, and his eyes shifted to the table, refusing to meet mine. I had always been the one to follow the rules, to stay silent, but not this time. I leaned in, my voice growing louder. He's not your son, is he? Not really. He's the product of an affair, isn't he? And you? I paused, my throat tightening. You never told me. You never told me that I wasn't the golden child, that I was the one who had to be perfect while you gave him everything without question. My mother gasped, the color draining from her face. My father's eyes softened, a flash of guilt crossing his features. I wanted to feel vindicated, to feel the satisfaction of watching their perfect little world fall apart. But all I felt was pain. We never meant for you to find out this way, my father said quietly, his voice low. It wasn't the way we wanted things to be. Jason is our son, in every way that matters. We don't. I cut him off, my voice sharp. Don't make excuses. You chose him. You've always chosen him. And I was just the one you had to make up for your mistakes. That's all I ever was. Just a backup plan. I was shaking now, my heart racing, but I couldn't stop myself. The dam had broken. All the years of holding back my anger, my confusion, my sadness, came rushing to the surface in a torrent of words I could no longer control. Jason doesn't even know. Does he? Does he know that he's the product of an affair? That you didn't even want him at first? Or is that another secret you're keeping from him? The silence that followed felt like 1,000 years. My mother's face crumpled as tears welled up in her eyes. She was silent, as if unable to speak. My father looked at her, his expression one of sorrow. He reached out, but she pulled away. We did what we thought was best. My father said, his voice strained. Jason, he was always meant to be part of this family. We just didn't know how to tell you how to make it right. It was never right. I spat. It was never right. And I'm done pretending. I'm done trying to be what you wanted me to be. You had your golden boy. And I was just the one who made everything look good. The weight of the words hit me like a tidal wave. And suddenly, I realized that I wasn't just talking to them. I was talking to the entire life I had lived. I was finally telling the truth to myself. The next few days were a blur. I stayed in my room. The house feeling colder than ever. The walls seemed to close in around me. My parents, predictably, tried to apologize. They asked me to come back to the family, to forget the truth and move on. They wanted to pretend that everything could go back to the way it was. But it couldn't. I couldn't. I had to make a decision. I thought about Jason. He wasn't my responsibility. He didn't ask for this. And he didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of this mess. But I couldn't keep living in a house built on lies. I couldn't be part of a family that had so easily dismissed the truth. In the end, I made my choice. I packed my things, said my goodbyes, and left. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay. As I walked away from the house that had once been home, I felt a strange sense of liberation. The world felt wide open, and I was finally free. I had no idea what came next, but I knew that the only person I had to answer to now was myself. And for the first time in my life, that felt like enough. Leaving felt like stepping into the unknown. For the first time in my life, I had no plan. I had always been the responsible one, the one who had it all figured out. But now, I was free, in a sense, but also completely unmoored. I stayed in a cheap motel for the first few nights, living out of a suitcase and letting the noise of the world swirl around me. I didn't call anyone. I didn't talk to anyone. I just needed to breathe, to be alone. The weight of my parents' betrayal pressed on me, but it was nothing compared to the relief I felt by being away from them. There was a part of me that mourned what I had left behind. But mostly, I was angry. I had lived my entire life believing in a family that didn't truly exist. The perfect facade they had built, the one that had been my entire world, was just that, a facade. But despite the anger, there was a gnawing sense of uncertainty. I didn't know what to do next. I didn't know who I was outside of that picture-perfect family. For years, I had been defined by the role I played in their lives. But now, with that role ripped away, I was left with a void. Who was I really? And more importantly, who did I want to be? It took a while before I felt like I could stand on my own. In the beginning, I was just trying to survive. I found work at a small cafe, a job that required nothing more than showing up and doing my part. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I started making a life for myself, however small that life seemed. I spent my evenings reading, thinking, processing, and over time, something shifted inside me. The anger began to fade, and in its place grew a quiet determination. I had to find myself. I had to understand who I was, beyond the constraints of my family. It wasn't going to be easy, and I didn't know how long it would take, but I had to start somewhere. It was during this time that I found a kind of peace. I realized that the person I had been, the one who had tried to live up to everyone else's expectations, wasn't the person I wanted to be anymore. I didn't have to be the perfect child. I didn't have to live up to a lie. I could be me, and being me meant being honest, with myself and with others. It wasn't long before I heard from my parents again. They called me, left messages, sent texts. They wanted me to come home. They wanted things to go back to the way they had been before the truth came out. But I couldn't. I couldn't go back to that life, to the life of pretending. One night, after a particularly emotional voicemail from my mother, I decided I needed to have one last conversation with them. It had been over a month since I left, and the tension between us hadn't dissipated, but something had changed in me. I was no longer the child who was afraid to stand up for herself. I was the person who had survived, who had found a way to move on, and I owed it to myself to have this conversation, no matter how difficult. I called them. The conversation was short, uncomfortable, and full of apologies that didn't seem to mean anything anymore. My father was the first to speak. "I never meant to hurt you," he said, his voice trembling. We just didn't know how to handle the truth. It was a mistake, a stupid mistake. You lied to me for my whole life, I said, my voice shaking but firm. And you made me believe that I wasn't good enough, that I had to be perfect, while you gave everything to him. Jason wasn't just a mistake. My mother interrupted, her voice soft. He's a part of this family, too. We love him just as much as we love you. Maybe it's time to stop pretending. I replied, maybe it's time for all of us to admit that our family wasn't what we thought it was. And maybe it's time for me to stop pretending that I'm okay with it. There was silence on the other end of the line. For the first time in years, I could hear the truth hanging between us. My parents were broken. In their own way, they had wanted me to forgive them, to sweep everything under the rug and return to the illusion. But I couldn't do that anymore. I had found my own truth, my own path. I can't come back, I said finally. Not like this. I need to be my own person now. I need to live for me. The words hung in the air for a moment. There was no yelling, no anger, just a painful acceptance. I understand, my father said quietly. I didn't know if I'd ever see them again, or if things could ever be the same. But I knew that I couldn't go back to the way things were. I had to move forward, no matter how hard it was. A few weeks later, after I had moved into a small apartment and started to settle into my new life, something unexpected happened. I received a letter. It was from Jason. My heart dropped as I opened it, unsure of what it would say. The letter was short, but it was enough. He didn't know everything, not yet, but he knew something had changed. He wrote about how our parents had treated him differently since I left, and how he'd started to ask questions. He mentioned that he felt torn, like he didn't really belong, like he was caught between two worlds. But the most important thing he wrote was this: I'm sorry, I know things have been messed up, and I can't imagine how hard this has been for you. I don't know how things will work out, but I just wanted you to know that I see you, and I'm sorry. I read those words over and over again, letting them sink in. I had spent so many years resenting him, believing he was the one who had it all, the one who didn't deserve the perfect life. But now, with these words in front of me, I saw a different side of him, a side that was just as lost and confused as I had been. For the first time, I felt a shift in my heart. Maybe things hadn't been fair, maybe they still weren't, but there was something here, something I hadn't expected. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, I could find my place in the world again. And maybe, just maybe, Jason and I could find a way to understand each other. In the months that followed, I slowly began to rebuild my life. I found a new sense of purpose in my work, started making new friends, and learned to enjoy my own company. But there was still one thing that haunted me: my relationship with Jason. We didn't talk every day, and I wasn't sure if we ever would. But one thing was clear: there was hope. There was a chance for healing, for growth, for a future where we both could find peace in our own ways. And as I walked down the street one day, feeling the sun on my face, I realized something that I hadn't understood before. I didn't need to be anyone else. I didn't need to live for my parents, or for anyone. The only person I had to live for was myself. And for the first time, that felt like enough. Time moved forward, as it always does. The world outside my window continued its relentless pace, unaware of the changes I was grappling with. The adjustment to my new life wasn't immediate, but slowly, day by day, I began to build something resembling peace. My work at the cafe became a rhythm that kept me grounded, even though it didn't fill the emptiness I had felt in the past. But it gave me something important: purpose. I stopped focusing on what I had lost and started to embrace what I had gained, the freedom to make my own choices. One evening, after a particularly long shift, I walked home feeling exhausted but lighter. I'd learned not to wait for the past to catch up with me, to let go of the need for approval or validation. It wasn't easy, but I was learning how to live for myself. Then, as I reached the door to my small apartment, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Jason. I'm coming to visit. I know you probably didn't expect this, but I want to talk. Maybe we can finally get some answers. I don't know where we start, but I think we need to. The words hit me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I had been living my life, putting everything about my family behind me. Yet here Jason was, extending a hand, unsure, but reaching out nonetheless. A strange mixture of emotions rose within me: hesitation, hope, curiosity. I hadn't seen him in months, not since I left home. Would this conversation change things? Would it make things worse? I didn't know, but deep down, I knew I couldn't keep avoiding the unresolved. The decision felt right, even if it terrified me. 2 days later, Jason stood at my door. He looked different, not just in the way he carried himself but in his eyes. The confident, carefree attitude he'd always displayed was absent, replaced by an uncertainty that mirrored my own. He wasn't the golden boy anymore. He was just a man, struggling to understand who he was, what he meant to our family, and what his place in the world really was. We stood there for a moment, the awkwardness hanging between us like a thick fog. Finally, I stepped aside, allowing him into the apartment. The silence between us felt heavy at first. We both sat down in my small living room, unsure of what to say, but knowing that something had to be said. "I don't know where to begin," Jason finally said, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. I guess I owe you an apology." I didn't say anything at first. I had expected him to say something like that, but hearing it felt like a weight lifting. Still, the anger that had been a constant companion in the months after I left was no longer as sharp. What I felt now was something far more complicated: empathy. "I don't blame you, Jason," I replied after a moment. "You didn't know, but I paused, the words catching in my throat. I didn't know how to reconcile what I thought was true with everything that came out. It wasn't just about you being the affair child. It was everything. The fact that my entire life was built on something that wasn't true. That hurts. It still does." Jason nodded slowly, his face falling. "I get it. I really do. I didn't know either. I was trying to be who they needed me to be. Just like you. I guess we were both part of this family's lie. In different ways." That hit me. We had both been pawns in a game we didn't even know we were playing. His struggle, my struggle, it was all rooted in the same thing. The lie that defined our family for so long. I said, taking a deep breath, "I've been so angry at you. At them. At everything. Because I couldn't understand why I was the one who was left with nothing. I don't know what I wanted. I don't even know what I want now." Jason looked at me with something akin to understanding. "I'm sorry you felt that way. You shouldn't have had to carry all of that alone. But I don't think either of us needs to fix what happened. I think we just need to learn how to move forward. Together, if we can." The simplicity of it all left me speechless for a moment. Was that possible? Could we really move forward from this? Could we heal, as individuals and as siblings? I didn't know, but the idea of it felt strangely comforting. The days that followed were filled with slow, difficult conversations. Jason and I started talking more about our childhood, about the years we had spent in the same house, living different lives without even realizing it. We talked about our parents, about the choices they had made, and about how both of us had been unknowingly shaped by the lies they had built. We didn't get all the answers. There were still so many things we didn't understand, so many wounds that had yet to heal. But we didn't need to have all the answers. We needed to build something new from the fragments of the past. One afternoon, as we sat together in my apartment, Jason turned to me with a smile. "You know, I never thought we'd be here. I thought everything would stay broken. But I think we're doing okay." I returned his smile, feeling the weight of his words in a way I hadn't expected. "Yeah," I said softly, "maybe we are. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't alone in this. Jason wasn't just the son of the affair anymore. He was my brother again. And while things would never be the same as they once were, I had the sense that we could forge a new path forward together." Months passed, and while the past never fully disappeared, it no longer defined me. I had stopped waiting for some big moment of resolution, for the sudden wave of closure that would make everything right. Instead, I learned to accept the messiness of life, the way things don't always turn out the way we expect. And yet, we find ways to keep going. Jason and I kept in touch, our relationship growing in its own organic way. We met up every few weeks, shared meals, talked about our lives. There were still moments of discomfort, but those moments became fewer and farther apart. And my parents, well, things were different with them too. We still didn't speak often, but the messages I received from them had changed. They weren't filled with apologies anymore. They were filled with attempts at rebuilding the bridge we had burned. It wasn't an easy road, and I wasn't sure I could ever fully forgive them. But I had learned that forgiveness didn't mean returning to the past. It meant freeing myself from its weight. One afternoon, as I stood by my window watching the sun set over the city, I felt a strange sense of peace. The world outside was still full of chaos, but in that moment, I felt like I was finally starting to live my truth. The past would always be part of me, but it no longer held power over me. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving, I was living, and that was enough.